He drew a circle to shut me out. Heretic rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle and took him in. Those words might be familiar to you. They've long been popular amongst Unitarian Universalists. They come from Edwin Markin, a poet and lifelong Universalist who was active at the close of the 19th and opening decades of the 20th century. They would have been known by the people who founded this congregation more than 100 years ago. As far as we know, the first sermons preached in our tradition in Houston were given in April 1895 by the Universalist circuit writer Colin. Shin did not serve a specific congregation. Instead, he traveled from place to place, trying to spread the message of universalism in cities and towns where there were no Universalist churches. His traveling habits were so great that once, when asked for his address, he simply replied, "Everywhere." He came to Houston repeatedly for over a decade. We have some of the titles of his sermons, and one of his initial addresses was called The Great Love. The Houston Daily Post recorded him in 1899 as having preached on the subject of paradise. What are we to live for but to make this world a paradise, a pleasant, happy place for all to live in, he is reported to have said. To make this world a paradise. The words from the earliest known text of a Universalist sermon in Houston also offer us the oldest articulation of a vision for this congregation. To make this world a paradise. I offer you these historic words at the beginning of my sermon on the congregation's proposed vision, Widening Love's Circle, because I want to make a simple proposition. I suggest that widening love's circle, making the earth a little bit more like a paradise filled with love and justice, has always been the vision of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston. As you might know, we are preparing to vote on a new covenant, vision, and mission. Last month, I spoke with you about the proposed covenant, which we just recited. It's an attempt to answer the question, what does it mean to be a member of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston? This month, we're considering our vision. It's an effort to respond to the query of what is the purpose of this church? In a couple of weeks, right before our congregational vote, we'll reflect on our proposed mission. It proclaims how we intend to live out our vision. Visions are supposed to be forward-looking. They're statements about what we intend to do together. In claiming widening love's circle as our vision, we are not just making a declaration of what we intend to do in the future, what we hope to accomplish, but we're honoring what we've done in the past. We're making a declaration of continuity. Widening love's circle. The history of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston goes back some 128 years. Though it was not until 1914, almost 20 years after Shin's first sermon here, that an enduring congregation was organized. That congregation, or perhaps I should say this congregation, was part of the American Unitarian Association. Most of its earliest members, though, were Universalists. They believed that God loves everyone, without exception, and that the purpose of religion was, as Shin claimed in his sermon, paradise, to make this the best of all possible worlds, a world where all souls can grow in unity with the divine and with each other. In our more than 100-year history, we have done this imperfectly. We've stood up for civil rights, we've worked to welcomed the LGBTQ community. We've worked with immigrants, the undocumented, and made our very sanctuary a sanctuary for those fleeing violence. But we have done it imperfectly because we are human beings and because we're an institution that was formed in the historically segregated South. In naming Widening Love Circle as our vision, we should both celebrate the ways in which we have successfully lived into that vision in the past and be honest about the work that still needs to be done. In her reflections on the unfinished business of Unitarian Universalism, the theologian Rebecca Parker tells us that we have broken our covenant with earth and with each other. Ours is a faith, she says, of promises unfulfilled. As a tradition, as an institution, and no doubt as individuals, we have failed to fully live into paradise that embody, or practices that embody loving, just, and sustainable community. Taking Widening Love Circle as our vision and seriously embracing that vision means trying to live into the promise of that covenant. Means inspiring each other to do better than we have in the past. At the same time, it calls us to be tender with each other as we consider our collective failings. A truthful understanding of the past will allow us to more fully live into our vision in the future. It will give us a clear conception of what is to be done. And so with that, of all the moments in the congregation's proud history that I want to turn to, I want to turn now, as we think about how we've widened love circles in the past, to the congregation's decision in 1954 to desegregate. It came 3 weeks after Brown versus Board of the Education was issued by the United States Supreme Court. It came a decade before the Supreme Court ended segregation in restaurants, and almost 15 years before the final lawsuits over desegregation in the city's public schools were settled. It meant that the congregation was the first historically white religious institution in the city to desegregate. It might have meant that we were the first historically white institution in the city of any kind to desegregate, though I'm not certain about that. Whatever the case, it's generally regarded as one of the congregation's proudest moments. In the 1960s, longtime member and unofficial historian of this congregation, Alice Cole, described part of the debate that took place around the congregational vote. It was originally suggested, she records, that the church integration be delayed to correspond with school integration. And it should be remembered that Brown versus the Board of Education did not call for immediate desegregation, but desegregation and deconstruction of segregation with all deliberate speed. Instead, a more loving vision for the congregation triumphed. The members decided that to live into our theology, they must lead in desegregation. The vote was not without dust and heat. However much members of the congregation believed in widening love's circle in the abstract, there were some who were far more committed to segregation and white supremacy than they were to the historic universalist vision of an inclusive God and the transformative power of love. Reading through the church's archives, it's possible to find some pretty chilling stuff written by white members of the congregation as they decided to leave it after the vote to desegregate. Horace Westwood, the minister at the time, received letters telling him he had made our church appear to be the pawn of the communists and objecting to his willingness to accept radical left-wing thinkers into the membership. One even went so far as to claim that his sermons were very little more than cleverly disguised propaganda, which follows the communist line. And another that those who had voted to desegregate had reduced the church to an atheistic organization with a primary emphasis on left-wing politics. All told, about 10% of the membership of the congregation resigned. Their correspondence suggests that they believed that widening love circle was all good and well as theology, but putting that theology into practice, well, that was another matter. Moving from the ethereal realm of rhetoric to the more difficult ground of action was too much for them. And here I'm reminded of a line from the poet Fyodor Dostoevsky: "Love in action is a harsh and dreadful thing compared to love in dreams." Working to widen love's circle, not in the abstract, but in real life, demands that we move outside of our comfort zones. It calls us to accept the challenge that building the world we dream about starts here in our own lives, when we push our own institutions, our businesses, museums, schools, and yes, religious communities to be more loving and just. Let me ask you this question. If this congregation was to truly embody the world we dream about, the world filled with justice, the world in which all souls are able to grow in unity with the divine, in which all being is honored, would you feel comfortable here? The sanctuary was built in 1952. Some of the people who used to sit in the pews you're now sitting in, some of the people who raised the money to pay for those pews, decided they were not comfortable staying in church, in a church that did more than just talk about creating paradise on earth. Talking about love was all good and fine for them, but putting into action, well, that was another matter. James Baldwin, writing a few years later, observed how shattering love and action, the work of widening love's circle, could be for people who believed themselves to be white, people who wanted to hold on to their privileges and powers. He warned that widening love's circle means giving up control. Love does not begin and end the way we seem to think it does. It means understanding God as liberation and accepting that sometimes, figuratively and sometimes literally, love is a battle, love is a war, love is growing up. Love is growing up. It's hard to grow up. Growing up, reaching towards something that we might call spiritual maturity, means recognizing that sometimes doing the right thing, the loving thing, requires sacrifice, necessitates drawing boundaries. In 1954, when the congregation took its vote to desegregate, its membership told the people who belonged to the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston that if they were openly committed to white supremacy, they were no longer welcome here. They were no longer welcome here if they continued to oppose racial equality. The congregational vote took place on June 7th, 1954. And according to what I've found in the congregation's membership books and archives, African American members joined almost immediately. By 1955, there were a handful of black children in the religious education program. And in the 1960s, the minister, Horace Westwood, was active in the civil rights movement. He was serving on the board of the Unitarian Universalist Association when the board decided to suspend its meeting in Boston and travel down to Selma, Alabama, to take part in the civil rights movement there. He marched with Martin Luther King Jr. He had a colleague, James Reeb, who was beaten to death by white supremacists. He shared sermons from this pulpit about tear gas, billy clubs, knots on one's head, bullwhips, and songs that defied the cold night. He warned that injustice and white supremacy were maintained by the indifference of ministers and the irrelevancy of the church. Widening love's circle. We live to make this world a paradise. It would be easy for this to be a self-congratulatory sermon. welcoming people of all kinds and all beliefs into membership into this congregation and into our religious education program was no minor thing in 1954. Marching in Selma, Alabama was not insignificant in 1965. But despite all of this, the congregation has remained overwhelmingly white for the past 69 years. There is another clue about why this is the case in our archives. There's a letter from the board president to Reverend Westwood dated July 6, 1954, just a month after the congregational vote. In it, the board president, his name was William Gray, reports that the members of the youth group had made some friends with kids in one of the African American Methodist Episcopal churches over in Freedmanstown in 4th Ward. The youth group wanted to go over to their friend's church one Sunday and explain to them all about Unitarianism and the meaning of the resolution. Mr. Gray assured Reverend Westwood that he had discouraged the youngsters who wanted to do this. He told the youth group member such an action would be in the nature of proselytizing and was counter to the spirit of our resolution. This congregation's decision to desegregate did not mean, in his words, that we were going to go out looking for African American converts. Reverend Westwood apparently concurred with the board president. He took no action to reach out to the black community. While he and First Church did much for the civil rights movement and did something to widen Love's circle, the congregation at that time was not ready to become too uncomfortable. Maybe losing a significant chunk of membership and some significant donors, and suffering from vitriol and bile from people who they thought had been their friends was too painful. Maybe they were scared because the truly just society, a congregation and a congregation that actually embodied the beloved community, meant that some of them would have to give up some of their power and privilege. Maybe they were prisoners of their time, only able to see so far and do so much, just as we are bound up by ours. I don't know. But I do know this. If we vote in a month to take Widening Love's circle as our vision, we should be ready to embrace it with full seriousness. We should ask ourselves, what does living into such a vision really demand of us? How are we willing to change? How uncomfortable are we willing to get? And it will call us to lean into our covenant and be tender with each other, as Patrice Curtis says we should. My kindness lays upon you and surrounds you. And when I fail, I frail myself. I turn yet again and again to be gracious to you. Widening Love Circle. If we vote to make this our congregation's vision, then we will be committing to two things. First, we will be reaffirming our historic commitment to bringing love and justice into the public square. We'll be saying that the purpose of this congregation is to build the beloved community and to be a harbor for those who cannot find love elsewhere. We'll be telling each other and all who wish to join us that to be part of the First Unitarian Universalist Church of Houston is to become part of a story and make it part of each of our own stories that revolves around a belief that it is our calling to make this world a paradise for all. And second, we will be acknowledging that our work is not yet done, that we will have to work to not only change our society, but our institutions and our communities and this church, and live with our own discomfort. He drew a circle that shut me out. Heretic, rebel, a thing to flout. But love and I had the wit to win. We drew a circle that let him in. Widening Love's circle, that it might be so, I invite the congregation to say Amen.